It's Warhammer versus Mace. Yeah, so some people have asked me to make a comparison of Warhammers, which is one of these, usually with a hammery side and a spiky side, and maces. Here's an example. This is a so-called flanged mace because it's got flanges on it. Okay. These occupy a similar place in medieval and Renaissance warfare. That is, they are both primarily used by people in armour against armour. They are fundamentally anti-armour weapons, and they are also both, as you can see from their length, they're quite short. They are predominantly used by horsemen, which of course fully armoured guys that we would sometimes call knights, would generally be wearing full armour, and they would spend most of their time fighting as cavalry, unless they were English, because the English like to fight on foot a lot and tend to use longer weapons than this, therefore. But these short weapons are really specialised as horsemen's weapons, and are, as aforementioned, anti-armour weapons. So what's the difference between a warhammer and a mace? Why might you choose one rather than the other? Well, this is a bit of a mystery. I should say straight up that the actual combat manuals or treatises dealing with these kind of medieval weapons and Renaissance weapons don't actually talk about these weapons very much. There is a slight, they're shown here and there in some treatises. For example, you can see a certain type of Eastern European warhammer appears in Talhofer, the 1459 version, I believe, maybe the 67 as well. And also there's a mention of them, I believe, in Pietro Monte, which is from 1498 originally, but published later or printed later. And equally you see maces here and there, but there are no real, really detailed descriptive accounts of how to use these things, as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, in any medieval or Renaissance treatises. However, we do have enough clues to know roughly how these things were used, and they were used more or less like a one-handed sword, or perhaps a messer was at the time, obviously with changes to account for their different form. They have no handguard, but you'd be wearing gauntlets, but they have no handguards to assist with binds, for example. They're fairly short. They're shorter than a sword, than a one-handed sword usually is. They're even shorter than a messer usually is. And obviously with a warhammer you have a spike on one side, which is for a certain type of piercing attack, but equally you can use it for hooking. Okay, but the thing to remember with the point is that points can get stuck in things. So whilst the point might be very good at penetrating through mail, for example, or even potentially through the thinner plates of some pieces of armour, or jamming into the joints of armour, it might get stuck. So your hammer face, for most of the time, unless you can see a particular opening to jam that point into, the hammer face is probably what you're going to use predominantly for smashing the opponent in the head and the knees and other places that are going to maybe impede his ability to fight. And then when you see an opening, you might spin it around to the point side and jam the point in somewhere. But you won't want to be sticking the point into things all the time. The mace, no options. An interesting thing about the mace is if you look at the warhammer, okay, you've got two directions on it. So in that sense, it's a bit like a sword, in the sense that the sword has two edges, and this essentially has two main striking faces. Yes, you might be able to hit with the end. You can hit with the flat. In fact, some warhammers have little spikes on the side here where the rivet goes through, so you could hit with the flat, but generally speaking, they're designed like an axe or a halberd, or a sword indeed, to hit either forwards or backwards, either way round. Okay, whereas a mace, a bit different to that. It can hit in any plane. Okay, so a mace can hit obviously with a backhanded strike, a forward strike. It can hit with the flat. You can sort of wrap around, do this kind of strike that you sometimes see in stick fighting, or cane fighting, or even in SCA fighting with rattan sticks, where you can actually wrap the thing round, because you don't have to worry about which bit. As long as you hit with the head, you don't have to worry about the plane that you're hitting with. So in that sense, I suppose, looking at the pros and cons of Warhammer versus Mace, which is what people want to hear about, the mace, I suppose you can be more indiscriminate with it. In terms of weight and length and balance, they're the same. They fulfill the same basic purpose. Okay, they're basically anti-armor weapons. They're quite heavy for their size, but they're quite short. Okay, so the mace you can be more indiscriminate with and hit any old direction you like, and you're going to have impact. However, it's not going to pierce really. These little spikes, they might pierce very slightly into mail, but really what those spikes are there for is not to pierce in the way that the Warhammer spike is there to pierce. So this will actually work like a dagger essentially to penetrate things with the Warhammer. But with the mace, the flanges are not really they're not gonna chop, they're not gonna pierce. Those points are really there to bind into the thing you're hitting, to concentrate more of the energy of the blow into the thing you're hitting. Obviously plate armour is designed to be deflective. So the reason why you have a mace with pointy bits on here, or some that you'll see that's like a ball with spikes sticking out, sometimes called a morning star, that type is really to bind onto the thing you're hitting when at the moment of impact, to transfer more energy to the target instead of glancing off and then a lot of energy is lost. Okay, and that's exactly the same reason that with the Warhammer you'll notice it's not a totally smooth or rounded or flat face, but you have a little spike in there. That spike is not really there to penetrate as such, but more to bite. Okay, so when you hit, it's not just going to skim off the helmet, it will actually bite slightly into the helmet and transfer all of the energy through into the target underneath the armour. Okay, so there we go. There's a few things about Mace versus Warhammer. They're essentially similar kinds of weapons, but they have different, very slightly different strengths or different advantages to each other. Okay, which is my personal favourite? I prefer the Warhammer. I just prefer the look of it, and I like the fact that you've got a choice of being able to do two different types of things with the head end, whereas with the mace you just kind of hit with it. Lastly, I should say, I'll just put the mace down for a second. I should say that I've concentrated purely on the hitting end of the weapon here. Okay, but just like with any other weapon, but particularly with medieval weapons, the whole thing is a weapon. So in close combat, I can defend with this part. Sometimes I can even defend with the bottom part. I can defend with the top here, I can hook with this part, I can hook with this part. If I have a spike on the end, I can jam in there. I can hit with the pommel, I can defend with it as a short staff, I can jam it into someone's elbow joint in here and assist to do locks and binds on their arm. If we come into wrestling, bam, and we're in armour and we've come in, we've grappled, if I can get this around the back of their neck, bam, in there, dunk, I can scissor their neck, use this as a wrestling and locking device as well. So there are all sorts of ways you can use this, not simply like in a computer game, hit, 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 but you can use it as a fully dynamic object. Any end of it, any part of it can be used in many different ways. Good, thank you.